Memoir of a Baby Boomer Life in the American Golden Era by Frank B. Thompson III, narrated by Adam and AI Voice. Copyright 2023. A Little History. I, on the other hand, am a more stoic person. A natural stoic, if you will, a philosophy that came naturally to me and likely some of my ancestors. My great-grandfather, Henry Baxley Thompson, 1859 to 1911, had signs he was a stoic by the ring he wore. A gold ring bearing the figurehead of Socrates. At the other end of the continuum are those who live by the motto, "I'm going to work until I die," as if slogging one's way through life is their utopian dream. Isn't there a happy median? So, just what is the meaning of life? This is a question I have asked myself since my youth, a question that has gained importance for me with the passing of time. At first, I found myself poring over old photos, researching the family's genealogy, all in an attempt to come up with some answers, but never quite getting them. The old photographs, the monikers on tombstones, and what I could recall were not enough to give me insight into what life meant. Another question began to evolve, the question of whether or not I had really lived life to its fullest, or had it been squandered away. I did not have the slightest idea what the answers were. Too many pieces of the puzzle, but not tabletop to put them all together. I began looking back at my past associations during chronological chapters of my life, events, and people that held special meaning, like the day I officially became a teenager. A thrilling moment because I knew then that I was becoming much closer to the time when I would be an adult and independent. I considered what I recalled in the period leading up to my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s, the milestones, the good, the bad, all the things that added up to represent my life. Gradually, an idea began to emerge. I can write a personal memoir. That would be the tabletop I needed to put all the pieces of my life's puzzle together. It wasn't like I was unfamiliar with the concept. I had, for instance, kept a personal diary for almost a month in 4th grade. And so, this tale began. A book of my life and something to aid me in reconnecting with my past, providing a reconnection into long-forgotten feelings, friendships, and special moments. What's more, the further I got into writing this narrative, the more at ease my soul began to feel. Deep down, I knew this was the very thing I needed to reassure myself that my time in this world had been rich and meaningful, that my life had not been misused, and that maybe I might discover some of the deeper, darker answers to questions some people begin to ask themselves as they climb in their waning years. Rekindling memories of one's past, the long-forgotten memories of past loves, the joys of youth, the adventure surrounding a new and unknown future. The hollowed-out feeling I once felt has indeed begun to disappear. I was now on the road to writing that one book that would hold the final chapters of my rather gilded life, to pick up where I once left off with that red, leather-bound diary of more than a half-century ago. I had not squandered away my time. I had not wasted my one and only shot in this life. And so, I most often find myself sitting in my favorite leather chair, in a quiet, cozy room, occasionally listening to nostalgic tunes to help jog loose the cobwebs of time. Let's eat and drink in our pasts, so that when tomorrow comes, when our end finally arrives, we will know that we had truly lived, and the written memories we leave behind will prove it. A little family background. The line of my Thompson family ancestry can be traced back to their earliest known English ancestor, Nicodemus Thompson, who arrived in Jamestown before 1685. Nicodemus Thompson Sr. was married to Mary Kempe on December 24, 1649, in Hatfield, near Doncaster, Yorkshire, England. They eventually settled in Onslow County, North Carolina, where their son, Nicodemus Jr., was born in 1685. Which is 100 years before the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Thus, Nicodemus Jr. is the great-great-great-grandfather of the Thompson family. My parents grew up during the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939, in Jacksonville, Florida. Dad was born on August 23, 1925, and Mother on August 28, 1928. I begin here to provide some comparisons with what typical life had been like prior to the Golden Age. Both grew up in the subdivision of Jacksonville known as Springfield, Founded during the 1880s, much of its local landmarks included the Florida Theater, the Park Lane, and the Carling high-rises. The heydays of the community were terminus with the end of the Roaring Twenties, which ran from 1929 to 1939. Here is what I have heard about their pasts. Mother, Betty Louise Wooten, was born on Tuesday, August 28, 1928, the same year when Mickey and Minnie Mouse characters appeared for the first in Plain Crazy. Dad, Frank Bivens Thompson, Jr., was born on a Sunday, August 23, 1925, the year F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote his famous novel, The Great Gatsby. The financial hardship of the times would eventually lead to divorces for both their families, real taboos back in those times. My maternal grandmother, Hazel Frances Grease, was born in Pennsylvania sometime in 1909 and would later marry Earl Fender. Hazel passed away tragically in September 1959 at the early age of 50. My memories of her are as a kind and gentle motherly figure. She was a second-generation German immigrant and was fond of being called Memoir by the grandchildren, likely the same reason Mother likes to be called the same. Interestingly, my great-grandmother, Gertrude M. Grease, 1884 to 1971, was said to be originally from the district of Greiz in Germany before coming to America, one of the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch immigrants. It was said by her that she was a distant cousin, a third cousin to be exact, of German nobility, and after a little research, I uncovered who that distant relative must have been, Empress Hermine Reuss of Greiz. Hermine was a German princess who became the second wife of Kaiser Wilhelm II, 6 or 7 years after he was dethroned by Hitler. The two met, fell in love, and would live most of their lives together in Holland up until the Kaiser's death, whereupon she returned to her ancestral home in East Germany. Born December 17, 1887, she died in the most tragic of ways in Soviet captivity on August 7, 1947. I know very little about Meemaw, save for my memories of a train trip with her from Tampa to Jacksonville. She married twice, first to my maternal grandfather, William Warren Wooten, Sr., who was born on August 12, 1903 in Paducah, Kentucky, died November 21, 1989. The two had 3 children, Warren Jr., June 24, 1926, October 31, 1992, my mother Betty and Gloria Ann, December 26, 1930. Mother's Wooten connections can be traced back as far as 1838 to a Tennessean John Wooten, a wheelwright. My paternal grandmother was Blanche Hallie Mae Turner, who was born May 20, 1906, died October 1976. Her grandfather had come to America from the Moulins, Les Metz province of France. Blanche married my grandfather, Frank Bivens Thompson, Sr., B. August 4, 1901, died August 16, 1984, whose earliest American ancestor, Nicodemus, arrived in the States sometime before his death on May 15, 1674. Dad has one sister, Monica Beth Abercrombie, whom I will touch on more thoroughly later. My paternal grandfather, Frank B. Thompson, Sr., was the son of a clerk of courts for a small West Georgia town called Vienna. He would leave home at 15 to join the Merchant Marine and served aboard the USS President Grant during World War I. His grandmother had been a McRae whose uncle had founded the small Georgia town of the same name in the late 1800s. I will be adding more on their backgrounds in later chapters. For now, let us get on to the things some of them lived through. Both Mother and Dad's parents knew one another, either growing up or as friends. Frank Sr. and Warren Sr. would often go out carousing together to do who knows what, save for one thing, they both gambled. Apparently, this was the major form of entertainment for men during those hard times. Hazel and Blanche were friends growing up. The two even lived together for a time in a boarding house down on Duval Street. Both girls would marry at too early an age, 14 or 15. The results were predictable, with both sets of parents ultimately divorcing. Granddad Thompson would move on to New York City. He had a brother, Mark, living there at the time, and may have become acquainted with the city during WWU, when he served aboard the cargo ship the USS President Grant. Traveling by train at age 5 or 6, Dad would live with his father for a time in conditions he says was best mirrored by the movie Cinderella Man, 2005. stark details of what families went through in New York during those difficult times. Back in Jacksonville, Granddad Wooten would leave Hazel and 3 kids to start up his own company and go philandering around. He would later remarry not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 times. I would never get to know this swinging dick all that well. He was to remain a near-perfect stranger up until his death, someone who had a billiards table in his garage, an automotive upholstery business on the side, and 3 or 4 dozen kids. I lost count. In all fairness to my Granddad Wooten, had progress not come along in the form of a rewritten moral code and the introduction of the birth control pill, I too might have easily followed in his footsteps. Of Mother and Dad, it was Mother and her siblings who had the most difficult time growing up. There was mention of Hazel leaving the kids to fend for themselves for days on end, of going to school without shoes, of the charity they relied upon from time to make ends meet. As a sign of how bad things were, even an occasional apple was like a gift from heaven. Thankfully, things began to improve when Hazel married Papa Earl Fender, a hard-working, rough, brawny South Carolinian who had been lucky and landed one of the stablest jobs during those times, a city employee with the local electric utility. Dad would return from New York City while his mother was dating the owner of a morgue, someone who gladly helped send the tot off to boarding school, St. Joseph's Academy, out in the middle of, then nowhere, Mandarin. Grandmother would later marry Thomas Jefferson Abercrombie, meeting him at the Jacksonville train terminal. That is the time when things began to turn around for Dad. Both attended Andrew Jackson Senior High School, but Dad, being 3 years older, would not meet Mother for several more years. That is when Wubwee II started with the attack on Pearl Harbor. During the war, Dad became part of the Early Warning Force, groups of private citizens and their motorboats who patrolled the inland waterways looking for Nazis. It was a time when the lighting along the coastline was blacked out to hamper German subs from knowing exactly where they were. It was a time when you could see fires burning out in the Atlantic, the result of American shipping being torpedoed by the Germans. The whole of America was mobilized for war. Dad would lie about his age and join the Navy at 16, with the goal of becoming what every kid his age aspired to be, a fighter pilot. But for poor eyesight, he was slated to become a belly gunner aboard one of the Navy's early torpedo planes, the Grumman Avenger. Thankfully, he missed the cut and became a radio operator aboard a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, otherwise I might not have been around to tell this tale. All but one of the aircrew he trained with survived the Battle of Midway. All others lost their lives after being shot down during that war-turning sea battle. Mother's brother and Dad, too, had joined the military. Warren Jr. was a Marine, and her father, Warren Sr., was a Seabee. Dad had been friends with Warren Jr. both before and after the war. They were roughly the same age and graduated during the same year. Dad had even flown over the fleet carrying Warren Jr. during the typhoon of 1944. Warren Sr. was working on one of the atolls when the typhoon struck. He was with the Navy construction battalions building landing strips in the South Pacific. All 3 men would later discover they had each endured in their own ways one of the worst of typhoons to strike the U.S. Navy, Typhoon Cobra. It was sometime on December 17, 1944, when Dad in his Skymaster was attempting to fly through the monster, at the same time Mother's brother was weathering the storm aboard a Navy transport somewhere below. Mother's dad, as already mentioned, was working on one of the tropical islands and must have remained pretty much unscathed, save for being a little waterlogged and a bit windblown. Dad, on the other hand, was knocked out cold by his flying typewriter when it went sailing like some heavyweight fighter's right cross-punch in all the turbulence. After the war, Warren Jr. would help get Dad his first job driving one of those mobile X-ray machines around the state screening for cases of tuberculosis. Warren Jr. would become an electrical engineer for Lockheed Martin, where he would retire at age 60 as a department director. Mother would become a flight attendant for Eastern Airlines during the war, then run by CEO Eddie Rickenbacker. She flew aboard a twin-engine Lockheed Electra. Her 2 notable memories included the time she and her flight crew were snowed in up in New York City with Frank Sinatra and company. The other was of a snowy day when landing in Washington, D.C. Pilots of those days flew by the seat of their pants. So in blinding conditions, it is no wonder the captain almost flew their twin-engine airplane into the traffic control tower. only at the last second, pulling out of danger's way. Mom, probably white-knuckled and frozen in fear, was looking out one of the rear windows when the pilot took quick evasion action. She says she watched on in abject terror as she saw her plane shoot past within feet of the tower, too close a call. To this day, she clearly remembers the air traffic controller leaping for cover, abject horror etched upon his features. Needless to say, this near miss would have an indelible effect on Mother. She would promptly resign upon returning to Jacksonville. So much for the airline business. Aunt Selma, Granddad Thompson's second wife, was working as a typist in the Empire State Building the day the four-engine B-25 bomber crashed into the building. The fog was the culprit. Aunt Selma would inadvertently experience the panic and horrors not unlike the World Trade Center attack some 7 years later. Mother and Dad met when he got back from the war and was attending Stetson University studying pre-law. Moping around the house during one of the weekend breaks, he was heartbroken. His high school sweetheart was off attending Juilliard, and the two had only been speaking to each other by phone. Blanche had likely gotten tired of seeing Dad feeling sorry for himself and had said something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Go on, get the hell out of here. Go over and pester your friend Warren for a while. Go on, get!" Aunt Gloria answered the door. "Yes, what do you want?" Dad's thinking, "Man, she looks hot," answers, "Is Warren around?" "No, Warren's out. Who are you?" "I'm Frank. Warren and I graduated from Jackson together." "Get out of town." "No, I'm serious," while thinking to himself, "No, she's too young, jailbait." "Do you know when he's going to be back?" "No, he didn't say." That's when Mom catches his eye. She's doing something in the background. "Wait for a second," he tells himself. "I remember her. That's Warren's sister, Betty. I used to ogle her on the city bus rides. Well, can I wait around for him? Say, who is that?" "That's my older sister, Betty. What's your name again?" "Frank Thompson. Hey, Betty, do you remember a Frank Thompson?" And so the two lovebirds were off and running, their first date in a car they later called the pig car, because it had been formerly used for hauling hogs around. It was also missing the floor on the front passenger side, a fairy tale come true. Soon after the two eloped, and married Wednesday, September 29th, 1948, at the Clerk of Courts in the Las Vegas of the South, Woodbine, Georgia, where anyone breathing could get married. Dad's age would have been 23, Mother's 20. Top music hits for 1948. 12th Street Rag by Pee Wee Hunt, Manana by Peggy Lee, and Bing Crosby's Now Is the Hour. 1955. The year of my birth was marked by several notable events, including the launch of the first nuclear submarine USS Nautilus, Hurricane Diane striking the Northeast causing over $1 billion in damage, Disneyland opening its doors, and McDonald's started franchising. I was born December 27th when the movie box office hit was The Man with the Golden Arm, starring Frank Sinatra. Autumn Leaves was at the top of the music charts, and Elvis released his first big hit, Heartbreak Hotel. Construction had just begun on the interstate highways, and Rocky Marciano retired as the only undefeated heavyweight boxing champion of the world. The 1950s was a great time to be born. The hula hoop had been invented in 1952. The Barbie doll would come on the scene in 1959. French poodles were everywhere, and something called telephone cramming would become the craze on college campuses across America. The idea for the last point was to put as many students into a phone booth as physically possible, with a record between 25. Youthful slang included just about any word one could come up with so long as it ended in "ville." Terms like Coolsville, Deadsville, Squaresville, Weirdsville, and so on. Ankle biter was a hip teen's term for a baby. Big Daddy was the descriptor for an adult. Cloud 9 meant you were really happy, and deuce was what hot rodders called a chopped-up 32 Ford. My story begins in one of those baby boomer suburbs called Southside Estates on Ivy Road. The end of the street was where my dad's first church was built, and next door was the parsonage we would call home for the first time. The 1950s were the heydays for traditionalist ministers like my dad, especially those who were just out of seminary, energized and filled with the Spirit. Believers who were willing to go door to door looking for new church members for their new sanctuaries. It was a time when the ministry was considered to be the second highest calling, just behind the field of medicine. Non-denominational, charismatic ministries like those fostered by Billy Graham had not yet become mainstream. The only competition was other traditionalist organizations, and churches were going up all over the place. Up through the early 1970s, there remained a big push to build ever greater, ever more expensive sanctuaries, and then the bottom fell out. My dad was no different from other ministers of those times, completing 2 new sanctuaries, the first being the church at Southside Estates and the second at Bayshore. Sadly, only one of the sanctuaries my dad served in remains part of the Methodist institution. Most have been sold off to non-denominational groups as part of the slow demise of Methodism. 1956. 100 years from now, it will not matter how much money you had. Age. One work was progressing rapidly on the new sanctuary of Southside Methodist Church. Construction is featured prominently in many old family photos. Outside the old church, which looked more like a school administrative building, a rare family photo was taken. Pictured in no particular order were Meemaw, Uncle Warren and his wife, the Abercrombies, including a teenage Aunt Monica, Reverend Churchwell with his all-white suit and his wife Lillian, and Mother holding a homely-looking, dark-haired baby that was me. Missing were Papa Earl and Dad, who were taking the picture. Papa never attended church services, at least as far as I know. Mother had a logical-sounding reason for his absence. I have come up with my own reasons for why I no longer attend church services. The cost of living sounds decidedly low compared to today's prices. The average cost of a new house was $12,000. The average monthly rent for an apartment was $88. Yearly wages averaged $4,500, and a new car would set you back $2,000. Buddy Holly was one of the top artists at the time. He would release Blue Day's Black Night in the early part of the year. 1957. 100 years from now, it will not matter how much money you had, the sort of house you lived in. Age 2. Walter Churchwell Thompson, July 17, 1957. Walter Churchwell Thompson, Skip, was born on a Wednesday, July 17, 1957, at the Baptist Hospital in downtown Jacksonville. I have always called him Skip, even though everyone today now calls him Walter. I cannot bring myself to use any other name. He, in all fairness, has my blessing to call me whatever he wants to. Hopefully something nice. My old nickname Biff would certainly work. On this day, tabloids across the nation were running headlines of a UFO chase by an Air Force jet that took them over 5 states before the aliens hightailed it to whatever dimension they had come from. It was a day when Pride and the Passion, starring Cary Grant, was the top-grossing movie across the land. Elvis Presley's All Shook Up was at the top of the music charts, and Jacksonville native Pat Boone released his hit single, Love Letters in the Sand. Yes, it was a momentous day. Walter was named after Reverend Walter James Churchwell, a Methodist minister and driving force behind Dad's entering the ministry. He remained a spiritual mentor for both my dad, mother, and their longtime friends, Reverend John and Helen Fletcher, up until his death on October 12, 1973. He was 89. We affectionately called him Granddad Churchwell, and his wife, Lillian, Grandmother Churchwell, and would visit them at their humble home on Post Street up until the time Dad left the ministry. He always, and I mean always, wore a white suit with matching shoes. Combined with his fair skin and white hair, he looked like a saint might. In fact, he was a saint in the minds and hearts of the hundreds upon hundreds of people he touched throughout his life, through his ministry, by acting as a mentor for fledgling ministers, by building a series of well-known churches in the North Florida area. Reverend Churchwell was born May 13, 1884, in Liberty County, Georgia, and grew up working in his family dry goods business, the J.H. Churchwell and Sons. From what Dad has told me, the company was a strong regional chain of stores with headquarters in downtown Jacksonville on West Bay Street. Their building stands to this day, but has been converted into a residential condominium exactly 1 block away from my residence. Granddad Churchwell would sell his interests in the family business to enter the ministry. I would have to say one of his most significant accomplishments in life had to be Edgewood Methodist Church. But Reverend Churchwell was a modest man, not given to self-aggrandizement, and this is reflected in his and Grandmother Churchwell's place of rest. I visited Riverside Memorial Park 10 years ago, a cemetery located off Normandy Boulevard near the I-295 overpass. I was greatly saddened by what I saw of their final place of rest. The two of them lay there side by side. Simple bronze plaques marked their grave sites. The resplendent setting I expected to find them in, a place where visitors could feel God's presence, a resting place covered by the shade of broad oaks, surrounded by lush greenery. A resting place that felt as if it were one small step from heaven. I expected to see their one daughter's grave next to them to keep the two company through eternity. But she was missing. Their graves gave no indication that the two of them had been tremendous forces for good during their lifetimes. Their graves were unadorned by flowers, nothing to indicate the kind people laying there in repose and the effect they had both had for so many when they were alive. Instead, there was no sign anyone had visited their gravesite for many decades. I stood there looking down upon two of the most important standouts in my early life, sweat running down my back as the sun beat down from above. I moved to a bit of the shade I noticed, an old, tall pine that had been left to grow not several yards from the bronze markers. It was sad to think these two important figures in our lives would end up there like that, alone, uncared for, unremembered. I vowed then and there that that would never happen to me or my loved ones. The small, quaint mausoleum, which both I and my loved ones will call our resting place, sits in an arboretum covered by the overhanging limbs of vast oak trees. There is a marble bench for visitors, those who want to spend a few moments out of their busy days talking to themselves, recalling memories of times long past. Upwards of 24 family members can ultimately call this spot their eternal home. It is a shady spot, a quiet spot, the sort of place I would wish for special people like Reverend and Mrs. Churchwell who will not be forgotten, at least as long as I am alive. What do I consider the best words to describe Granddad Churchwell? Spiritual, confident, righteous, wise, and virtuous. What about Grandmother Churchwell? How would I describe her? Likewise, spiritual, righteous, and maybe a little insensitive. My first memory was of a serene wagon ride by an engaging teenage girl out on the road. I wasn't more than 2 or 3 at the time, therefore everything prior to this first memory remains blank. What did my parents have to say about that dark period? I cried a lot. Next stop, Tampa. 1958. 100 years from now, it will not matter how much money you had, the sort of house you lived in, or the kind of car you drove. Skip's age. 1 my age. 3. The year was representative of changes to come. American auto manufacturers continued to build bigger and heavier cars with ever larger engines, while Japanese imports began coming on the scene. The first American satellite was launched from Cape Canaveral. The first microchip was developed and would lead to the invention of the personal computer some 3 decades hence. And almost every household in the country had at least one television set. Television was one of the only forms of entertainment we had as kids. We were like almost everyone else with 1, maybe 2 black and white sets. Our kids' model rolled around on wheels and became a babysitter of sorts for a long, long time. I am not quite sure, but I suspect we may have gone without one for some time. Why else, when the thing magically arrived, would we get up at the crack of dawn in a Christmas morning-like state to watch The Lone Ranger and Tonto? It may have been that cowboys and Indians were in vogue back then and a big part of Americana. There were, after all, at least a dozen westerns to watch, including The Cisco Kid, Death Valley Days, Fury, The Gene Autry Show, Gunsmoke, Hopalong Cassidy, My Friend Flicka, Wagon Train, and The Roy Rogers Show. I still have a copy of the photo with my brothers and me dressed up as gunslingers on a Christmas morning, complete with resplendent cowboy boots, chaps, cowboy hats, 6-shooters, holsters, Skip with an upside-down soap bubble pipe, all trying to look tough like gunslingers. Hell, we might have even been wearing spurs for all I know, and we owed this gay attire to Papa, Earl Fender, who had a hand in just about any grand surprise that came our way throughout his life. Yes, of course, we had a horse in the stable, one of those spring-loaded, bouncing contraptions that has long since disappeared from the department store shelves because too many kids were falling off the things, me included. On the other hand, the television was always a lot safer way of occupying a toddler's time, which means we were parked in front of one whenever possible. The television was like a portal to some other dimension. That was as long as the programming was sufficiently entertaining. Families across the country would adjust their schedules to accommodate the times their favorite programs aired. There were no VCRs, of course, just the television section of the newspaper, and, for some, the TV guide. Past television programs have become an important means of retracing my past. For me, they act as reference points that trigger long-forgotten memories. I will be listing the more relevant of these time wasters at the beginning of some of the chapters. Cartoons were the big things to watch when I was growing up. Here are some of the standouts I recall. There was Popeye the Sailor Man, who reminded me of Papa and Popeye's sidekicks, Olive Oyl, Bluto, and Wimpy, with slugging, kidnapping, pounding of heads, spinach munching, more slugging people in the choppers, and gorging on all those fatty, wimpy burgers. All that violence was on full display every weekday at roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Brutality seemed a natural part of growing up in the 1950s, on television, for most of the games we played, and as the principal means of disciplining one's children. Dr. Benjamin Spock's bestseller. The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care was written in 1946 and was what most progressive-thinking mothers turned to as a framework on how to raise their children. Mine, I believe, read it. This pediatrician psychoanalyzed children and families during the 1940s and concluded parents need to be more flexible, more affectionate, and less brutal with their kids compared to previous generations. Even today, you can still see the occasional parent who has carried along the baggage of those more arcane times, occasionally seeing them spanking the crap out of their kids or cursing them out in public. I once ran away from home with a suitcase in hand for perhaps an hour, with my mother's fond farewell. I'm sure my departure was spurred on by either one of two things. One, I didn't want to go to school when I was 5, especially if everyone else was going into first grade at age 6. 2, if I was going to have to go to school, I did not want to have to give up my every Sunday being forced to go to church. After a short time, I found myself saying something like, "Golly gee whiz, I guess I'm going to have to concede defeat. I really am going to have to give up my every Sunday, even if I have to go to school for the rest of my life." I was only a block from home when I realized I was already homesick and was going to have to swallow my 4- or 5-year-old pride. It also was not going to be the last time I had to eat crow. Kudos to Dr. Spock. It had to be his influence at work. What else could explain why Mother had helped me pack a suitcase, then let me stroll off all by my lonesome and with a fond farewell? 1959. 100 years from now. It will not matter how much money you had, the sort of house you lived in, or the kind of car you drove. But the world may be different because you were important. My age. For Skip's age. 2. Mark Wayne Thompson, January 30th, 1959. Mark is my third brother in this little tale. He was named after his great-uncle, Granddad's older brother of the same name. The contemporary Mark was born on Friday, January 30th, 1959, at the Tampa General Hospital. Notables for the month. Congress held its first hearings on the bill to admit Hawaii as the 50th state. The first American passenger jet service began with American Airlines, Boeing 707s flying between Los Angeles and New York City, and bicyclist Walter Stoll began his epic bike ride that finally ended some 400,000 miles later on December 12, 1976. I will be going into Mark later. He was the first hellion among us, beginning at a very tender age. Our church at Bay Shore was a place of worship without the sort of steepled sanctuary most of us are used to seeing today, but instead was a simple brick meeting hall with a cross erected out front to let everyone know it was, in fact, a house of worship. The original sanctuary still stands today, next to the proper church Dad built. The sanctuary is located on South MacDill Avenue, just down the road from the Air Force Base of the same name. The day Dad arrived, to put things in order, he was hit in the head by ceiling plaster when he forced open the front door. Our home was located at West Bay Court, a 1929 Craftsman bungalow wood frame with red brick columns and a simple front porch. The home still stands today and recently sold for $300,000, a bit unbelievable considering the age, save for the location. We lived just 1 block away from the church, less than a few houses away from McDill Avenue with Tampa Bay down at the opposite end of our little 2-lane blacktop. It was a quaint community with a local pharmacy and a locally owned gas station less than a couple of minutes away by foot. We rarely walked anywhere, however, and mostly drove to get around. I chalked the driving up to the extracurricular activities we always seemed to be shoehorned into attending following church service. Things like going to visit families like the Wingos, or the occasional partitioner-paid lunch at Morrison's cafeteria. The median income for a typical American family was $3,600, the equivalent of $44,000 today. A minister made roughly half that. But let's face it, Dad had not entered the vocation for the money. On the flip side, we Thompson kids probably earned what could easily qualify as a degree in Christianity after attending nearly every Sunday church service up until the time Dad left the ministry, nearly 2½ decades later. I ran the math, and that turns out to be over 1,300 hours of sitting on those hard, uncomfortable wood pews. I call to mind our new home was equipped with all the comforts of home. One of those ringing washing machines that had been around since the 1700s, a fireplace we never used. And since central air would not become available for another decade, and those window units were still a little too expensive for those of modest means, we used fans. The same was true for our one car. Much of the furniture was handmade, or hand-me-downs from our grandparents. For many older homes, and schools for that matter, fans remained the primary means of staying cool. We were no different. We had one of those large, immobile fans stuck in the window of the kids' room, not in baby Mark's room, but where the 2 occasional bedwetters, Skip and I, slept. To keep the bugs out, all the windows were screened, and during anything but a couple of weeks of winter were largely left open throughout the year. ... It was Florida after all, and hot as hell most of the time. Many families had one or more popular floor models, squarish-looking fans that could be easily toppled, but provided the only real respite from those long, hot summer days. Many kids would find out those floor models had an element of entertainment built into them because it turns out you could talk or sing into the air intake side of the thing and your voice would magically change. This was loads of fun and did a bit to break up the monotony of a larger, housebound existence for toddlers like yours truly. Since time memoriam, Florida has been and will continue to be the lightning capital of the world, making thunderstorms an everyday, summer delight and raising the excitement level for kids and adults alike. Why? Because the windows of the car or our home always open to cool the darn place off. This meant that all that separated us from a close call was a flimsy wire mesh screen, or having to roll up all the windows in the car and fog everything up. Most autos did not have air conditioning back then. If the lightning was really bad, everyone could scoot for cover, usually on the floor. Often under the beds, cowering, terrified in fear, as I recall. More than once, I would swear I saw portions of lightning bolts enter the room through the open window. On the plus side, rain always brought some reprieve from the humid heat, nature's blessed form of air conditioning. Let's now move on to my Cheerio experiment. Did you know doctors made house visits back in the 1950s? No, well, they did. The doctor made at least 3 house visits thanks to the mumps, the time I had a severe asthma attack and had to have a shot, and that one time I stuck a Cheerio up my nose. I remember our doctor making 1 house call when I got the mumps. I clearly recall he visited while I feverishly tried to watch The Wizard of Oz through nearly closed-shut eyes. On the matter of the cereal, all I can come up with, on what I must have been thinking at the time, was I had thought my nose was just another way to eat Cheerios. Why? Because I could breathe through both, and both seemed to end up going to my throat. Brilliant. Or it could have been another related point. One of the worst things a child of the 1950s and 1960s suffered when it came to television programming when homebound, those god-awful goth soap operas. My God, how in the world can anyone sit around all day watching those totally morose ramblings, especially kids? The kitchen was a special place because of its formica floor you could clean up quickly so you could eat, play with fire, or make it a dentist's office, even a barber shop. One of those occasions was when the parents turned off the lights and lit a candle in the center of the linoleum-topped table, kind of like a seance. The three of us could sit around watching that flame for what must have seemed to Mom like hours. Mesmerized by fire, we looked like cave kids sitting around a campfire, where we learned some useful tidbits from the parents. One, you could pass one's finger quickly through the flame without getting hurt. Two, if you held your hand over the flame too long, it would burn. With parental supervision, we were shown, I think, how you could hold a flammable object up over the flame some distance and it would catch fire. All really useful tips to help us on our way through life. Lighting farts on fire. One of the more extreme cases where a fire could be used to amuse and entertain came to my attention some 2 decades later at a Presbyterian church retreat called Montreat. Word had gotten out that something really cool was happening in one of the dorms and was a must-see. We, my friend Terry Williford and I, arrived through an open window, much like we had on other occasions to avoid the hall monitors, chaperones who tried in vain to keep us teens in line. Our group from Jacksonville, for example, was kicked out of our regular sleeping quarters and put on curfew when a few of the more rambunctious of us used one of those older turn-upside-down fire extinguishers on the girls' sleep quarters. We sat down together with a half-dozen other teens in a darkly lit room, only the flickering of candles adding to our excitement. So, what could the guy do to impress the girls? To impress us? There had already been several shows earlier that evening. The question suddenly arose, does he have another one in him? Had the guy run out of gas? After much begging, a few threats, cajoling, and hopeful praise, the stud agreed to do an encore performance. The room went quiet with anticipation. Without a thought of how it might appear, to the girls, to his fellow amigos, he bent over and pulled his pants down. He kept his underwear on, thank God. We were, after all, at a church retreat. He remained bent over, a lighter in his hand, peering back through his widespread legs in the direction of his audience. "Here goes," he said. He flicked the flint with the thumb of his hand and sparks flew. He flicked the flint again. There was a flame. So far, so good. Now for the hard part, timing. Had to be just the right distance, just the right amount of push, but not too much, otherwise, a disaster. Poof, whoosh! It was ... It was like a flamethrower coming right from out of his underwear. Ayy! There were oohs, eehs, and some laughter. He could have easily singed off his pubic hairs had he not kept his underwear on. I have no idea how someone could have put those pieces together, certainly not on their own. There was, after all, no internet or YouTube back then, so how? Had to have been passed down from generation to generation, from dad to son, from time memoriam? I wonder if the family legacy continues to be passed down to this day. Check out this internet version of lighting a fart with a lighter to witness the wonder of it all. So let's return to our humble kitchen where the family sat around, moving their fingers in and out of the flame of a candle. I also believe it was the kitchen, where we all learned how to make music with a soda bottle by blowing over the opened top. I believe this was part of Dad's contribution to our early education. Our first playground for us consisted of the backyard, the front yard, and the empty lot with the banyan tree next door. Outdoor toys for me included, first a tricycle, then a bike with training wheels, then the same bike without training wheels, a little red wagon, a pedal-powered metal car, the yard tools in the one-car garage, the swing set, a car tire hanging from a tree, to the miniature playground spinner that made me throw up after eating my first coconut. The reason I've not liked coconut ever since. There was a concrete sidewalk out in front, just this side of the road that connected MacDill Avenue and the causeway around Tampa Bay. This sidewalk was where we cut our teeth on riding our wheeled contrivances and garnered the first badges of honor, skinned knees, skinned elbows, and probably bruised heads. From the front yard, you could see the causeway at the far end of our street, and you could easily smell the red tide when it rolled in. Roll Tide. It was a grand time to be living next to an Air Force base, the fighter pilots on occasion lighting up the afterburners on their Delta Wing F-102S and F-106S just overhead. It seemed to me to be a marvelous thing, the sudden boom of the sound barrier being broken. And so what if their shenanigans broke a few windows here, or their ... IT was all in fun. The first human to break the sound barrier was Chuck Yeager on October 14, 1947, and by the time the late 1950s arrived, everyone seemed to be doing it. There was nothing quite like having a sonic boom suddenly overtake you when you're least expecting it, like when you're shaving with one of those straight-edge razors of the 1950s, or getting a haircut at the local barber down the street, or putting the final touches on an oil painting you'd spent the last 10 months putting to the canvas at the University of Tampa. As a kid, I found those displays of raw, brute self-indulgence, being cut loose overhead, the shuttering of the windows. It was kind of like fireworks on the 4th of July. I couldn't wait for the next one to hit. Sadly, the days of breaking that barrier would end far too soon. With that excitement missing, I suppose it's now time to move on to something a little more blasé, our kids' playpen. Here are some of the first discoveries I made from our first playground: the yard, the street, and the empty lot next door. I saw my first rainbow from the front yard and believed my mother when she said there could be gold at one of the two ends of the multicolor arch in the sky. It had to be true. I'd seen The Wizard of Oz after all. I came across my first black widow spider behind the whitewashed garage with its red hourglass-shaped symbol, distinct and scary-looking. I also discovered what our parents called the funny bone when I fell on a hard patch of Shell's knees first, my first experience with a new sort of pain. We were big drive-in movie buffs, which meant it was always a major event. Drive-ins, but movies in general, are another way I have kept track of past events, and will be listing some for reference at the beginning of some of the chapters. Drive-ins in the 1950s and 1960s were in vogue, complete sellouts for movies like South Pacific, El Cid, and The Thing from Outer Space. At dusk, on a summer night, driving through the gaily lit entryway, parking next to one of those monotone metal speakers with the mosquitoes soon buzzing everywhere unseen, and finding little difficulty saying hello through the open car windows. Then there was the nose of the bug incense burning and filling the passenger compartment with carcinogens, those green circular coil things, the occasional slice of cheese pizza, the rear floorboard where I spent entire movies hiding from the monsters and aliens of that 1950s science fiction B-movies our parents liked to occasionally throw into the mix. Back then, almost everything seemed to be off-limits to ministers. Smoking and drinking were, of course, off-limits. But so too were card games like Pinochle. I now wonder if the drive-ins were the only way we could go see movies. Movies that might have offended parishioners. Just about every movie out. I don't recall either parent going to an indoor movie theater together. It was usually Mother who would take me on occasion to see films like Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady, but the first I do recall was Disney's Pinocchio. Pinocchio was playing in downtown Tampa at a theater that resembles the Florida Theater in Jacksonville. I remember it being a typical summer hot and muggy day because, again, there was no darn air conditioning in the car. I also remember all the noxious fumes on those downtown streets, especially when a bus next to us belched out the typical Cloud's diesel exhaust any time the driver pressed the accelerator. Thank goodness, after parking and finding it was almost a sold-out event, we finally got to the balcony seats and into one of the rare places with air conditioning. Outside the church, the closest indoor movie theater with the mural of laughing and frowning faces looking at one another, and the several times we were treated to Morrison's by one of the parishioners, or the occasional trip to the public supermarket, there were nothing but fans. I still vividly remember the day we had the first under-dash-mounted air conditioner installed in our car. Skip, possibly Mark, and I sat sweltering in the back seat of the four-door as the auto shop mechanic worked his magic. At least that is how I recollect it now. I also recall the marvel and joy we all felt when that air conditioner was turned on for the first time. It was heavenly. Back to the drive-ins, the sleepy ride home, and if you were lucky and small enough, on top of the rear window dash cars had back then. Much too soon I became too large for this much cherished backseat accommodation. Now sure, the kid blocked Dad's rear view, but so what? Hey, we didn't even have seatbelts back then. Anyhow, I had to watch, probably protesting as my younger brothers jockeyed for that little roost. But after a time, they too had grown and were back on the rear bench seat. At the time, the Fiji Islands must have been as yet uncharted by American tourists. Tiki torches were going up everywhere. The restaurant or hotel, not sure which, across from the drive-in entrance had them. Real flames, totem poles with savage faces, lots of tropical-looking palms. It was new, foreign, and a real novelty to see. It was just down the road from the kindergarten my brothers and I attended before going off to a life in public schools. Mom was a great hairstylist, and she honed her skills using the three of us as guinea pigs. Well, possibly Dad, too, because he had the same hairstyle. Back then, haircuts were pretty simple, generally. You left the set for the electric shears at a 1/4 inch and simply followed the contours of the skull. There was, however, one time when she pushed the limits on styling using bowls as templates for a Mo Howard Three Stooges-style haircut. We had to look like mushrooms. I, of course, was too naive to care one way or another, and as it turned out, I was quite the hit at school. Needless to say, having been laughed at and made fun of most of the day, I insisted I be shaved bald upon returning home, so I would fit in with the other kids of the 1950s. By the way, I don't believe Skip or Mark would have even noticed the debacle done to their noodles. They were lucky. But they weren't in school yet. Always fashion-conscious, Mom had gotten the hint Mo's hairstyle wasn't in vogue, if it had ever been, and promptly shaved my brothers' heads around so we looked the same, like our old selves. The other thing I remember about haircuts was the high chair in the kitchen without air conditioning, without a shirt, the linen cover sheet, the sweat. How the hair always clung to my damp skin and all the itchiness that ensued as a result. I suppose I was generally the first to be experimented upon when it came to events like tooth extraction. I'm not sure if anyone still does this. I'm not sure if my brothers experienced the same fun, and yes, it still strikes me as a little medieval. Namely, the tying off of one end of a string to one of my loose baby teeth, the other to the kitchen doorknob. Need I say more? It took a couple of trials runs for her to get the kinks worked out. I must have looked like a fish hooked on a line as she swung the door back and forth to test the tension, to gauge what sort of force would be needed. And then there was all my crying and pleading. "No, Mommy, please, this is a bad idea." Slam, yes, it worked. Yes, I was relieved it got that wiggly tooth out of my head, but did I ever ask her to do it again? Of course not. Did any of my brothers get the same treatment? Skip might have. I seem to recall him going through the same pleading, crying tirade I put on with one of his teeth tied off to that same doorknob. Church services were, of course, a part of my more notable memories. Dad's sermon on the choice people had in life, of either building one's life on a sandy, easily dispersed foundation or on bedrock, meaning God's teachings, would ring in my ears from this early age on. Mother and Dad both sang solos before the congregation with Schubert's Ave Maria, the most stirring for me from either parent. There were the sticks of juicy fruit gum Mother handed each of us during church service, probably to keep us quiet. There is a multitude of covered dish dinners with those homemade cheese casseroles, sugary cakes of all sorts, and all the sweet iced tea you could stomach. There were many Easters and the sporting of new church clothes. Then there was my first overnight, a camping trip with the scout troop. I remember there were a number of campfires burning around the campsite. I probably stood around staring long and hard into them thinking, fire is good. There was the air mattress I went lights out on that looked a lot like a blow-up beach raft. There was a large walk-in tent I called home for at least one night. I felt like boys my age must have felt back in the days of Daniel Boone, only in their case, it was not contrived but a real, everyday existence. The campsite I remember being on a huge oval lake, and someone had been thoughtful enough to bring along a ski boat to add to the festivities. I did not get to go out in the thing. It was probably in high demand, but Dad, being the minister and all, was out being towed behind the thing at a second's notice. I recall standing on the beach, watching with pride as the scout troop leader pointed out how well my dad was doing. "Look, he's up!" exclaimed the scout leader. Yes, he was right. The minister had gotten up on his skis. The first try. Wow, he could do it all. It was a huge lake, and the plan was to apparently take Dad for a complete lap around the monster. I've done some skiing myself. Nothing professional, you understand, but I know what it's like to be pulled around for a while, and how one's legs start getting tired if you're not used to using them as shock absorbers. Soon Dad was lost in sight as the ski boat sped off to the right, following the shoreline. The minutes passed, and he remained invisible from view. "Look, there he is!" announced the scout leader, pointing across to the opposite side of the 10-kid-mile-wide body of water. I look to where the man is pointing, and I see a tinny-weeny little motorboat coming into view, and the speck behind it must have been Dad. "He's doing very well, your dad." More beaming pride on my part. "Wow, he really knows what he's—" Kerplunk! There was suddenly a mighty splash of water from where that speck, that was Dad, had been. I could even make out the shower of water from my distant vantage point. I would have to gauge that tumble on a scale from 1 to 10, a 9. It was a mighty fall, maybe even a faceplant. Is he going to survive? I think I might have asked the kind gentleman. "Oh, yes," he assured me. "Your dad's a young fellow." He was right. I was 5 or 6 at the time, which would have put Dad somewhere around 35 or 36. The minutes ticked by as the motorboat made a U-turn and loitered around the downed skier. I was wondering, what were they doing? "Look, he's up again," announced the scoutmaster. Sure enough, that speck of a man was again trailing behind the speedboat, not giving up on the mission of completing a lap around the humongous lake. 15 minutes later, the motorboat with Dad in tow arrived back at the camp, winded and more than likely hungry. It was now time for some of those fantabulous hush puppies the adults were serving up. There was the annual Gasparilla Pirate Festival, which was also an extremely cool event for a kid, and a lot like a version of Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean ride. Back in the late 1950s, you could sit on the bank of Davis Island and catch the pirate doubloons the cast members cast to kids like ourselves. I don't know what the Gasparilla Festival is like today, but in the 1950s, the island was a breeze to get onto, park, and watch the annual event from the Tampa General Hospital grounds. There were, after all, 1/2 fewer Americans alive. 180 million then compared to 366 million today, and 1/3 fewer cars, 62 million juxtaposed to 187 million. We were also lucky because the Jose Gasparilla, the 160-foot-long pirate ship, had only been recently built in 1954 for the event. For me, at least, the most treasured things I came away with were the cheap metal doubloons the pirate characters threw to those of us lining the shoreline. That and the colorful flags that adorned the rigging, and then there were those booming ship cannons and musket fire, as the Jose Gasparilla slowly made its way past Davis Island. Jolly Roger flew bravely from the tallest of the masts. My other memories of those times include sitting inside a 3-wheel BMW Isetta and marveling at how the steering wheel was part of the one front door, which also acted as the front end of the tricycle. Eating out at McDonald's, a lot. Making sure those communions, shot glasses didn't have any grape juice left in them after church service, and the tour aboard the world's largest dredge ship, captained by one of the, you guessed it, church members. There was the occasion I realized I might have a slight fear of heights when we took our first joy drive over the original Sunshine Skyway Bridge, completed on September 6th, 1954. Mrs. Wingo's awesome fudge, and still the best I've ever had. The time I nearly blinded myself when, through my haste to be the first, I looked through the Wingo teenage son's telescope at the sun before he had a chance to put the smoked glass filter in place. I remember spending countless kid hours looking through a stack of National Geographic magazines our parents had collected, and the one edition, in particular, picturing an F-4 Phantom under full afterburner taking off from one of the Navy aircraft carriers on the front cover. Toys, too, were uncomplicated sometimes, but rarely ran on batteries and would never pass today's safety smell test. Most turned out to be cheesy plastic letdowns you'd get in the mail after sending a dozen or so box tops for Cheerios off to some weird-looking address, a post office box. Junk like the 2.5-inch toy sub that looked a lot bigger on the cereal box that eventually arrived in the mail. The toy was supposed to float and submerge on its own, but only worked as long as you had some of those dissolving pellets that came with the packaging, 5 or 6 as I recall. Then there were all those plastic toy soldiers which were the rage of the time for twerps our age. One toy soldier had a parachute attached to its plastic shoulders. You'd toss it into the air for hours on end and watch it float down until it eventually drifted down to get hung up on a telephone line or up in a tree. One kid I remember, a spoiled brat who wouldn't share, as I recall, had an entire army of toy soldiers, tanks, and cannons, enough to take up his family's entire living room and spread out on a floor mat that resembled a battlefield. For some reason, dart blowguns, like those pictured in the hands of barely clothed natives in National Geographic, came on the scene with one winding up in the hands of one neighborhood kid. Thankfully, he was a good guy, simply demonstrating its use and not turning the novel toy on either my brother or myself for sport. We had little idea how dangerous some things were at that age. To round things out, I remember going on a strawberry picking expedition. There was that first fishing trip aboard a parishioner's runabout, tied up next to a bridge for what seemed an eternity. It was hot, and no, we did not catch anything. What were some of the other lasting memories I have of the 6 years at Bay Shore? Other than Mother was really smart, thanks in no small part to Dr. Spock and his book, it had to be the realization that I was really part of some sort of family business, the ministry. Like most children of the 1950s, this meant I was to be seen and not heard on steroids. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am were about the only things I was expected to say when responding to an adult. Opening the door, shaking hands, and playing the part of angel during church services were all part of the job. Being the eldest also meant I was expected to be a role model of sorts for my brothers, and I was usually the first to find out what it meant not to toe the family line. Spock may have enlightened some parents, but he could not erase the deepest memories of his parents' own childhoods during those more parochial times. As such, many parents quickly reverted to tried and tested methods of disciplining children, with threats of a physical nature being the typical response. All in all, it was still a great time to be a child. Coloring Easter eggs Memoir passes away in September 1959 at age 50. Mark Thompson was born on January 30th, 1959. Tadpoles to frogs.